The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal frequency as Brooke Sullivan folded the blue scrubs for the 7th time that morning, creasing each edge with the precision of someone who'd once folded body bags. 3:47 a.m. The Cedar Creek Medical Laundry Room smelled like industrial bleach and the faint copper tang of something no amount of washing would fully remove. She worked alone, the way she preferred, her hands moving through the rhythm they'd learned in a different uniform, in a different lifetime, in a place where careful folds meant the difference between honor and disgrace. The scars on her forearms caught the overhead light as she worked. Long, jagged lines of white tissue running from wrist to elbow, shrapnel wounds from a night in Ramadi that the hospital records didn't mention and the Joint Chiefs of Staff had ordered erased. She'd stopped wearing long sleeves 3 months ago, decided that pretending they weren't there was another kind of lying. The other nurses never asked. They never noticed the tremor that moved through her hands at precisely 6 in the morning, every morning, muscle memory responding to a schedule of mortar fire that no longer existed. Pain was information. Information was survival. And Brooke Sullivan had learned to speak the language of survival better than she'd learned to speak almost anything else. She returned the stack of scrubs to the shelf, each folded unit aligned with geometric precision, and caught her reflection in the window above the sink. 38 years old. Hair pulled back so tight it looked like a choice rather than a requirement. Eyes that had seen things that would make most people's hands shake, but hers didn't. Not in public. Not anymore. The morning shift would start in 18 minutes. Vital signs at 6. Breakfast trays at 6:15. Charts at 6:30. She'd been running this same rotation for 3 years, ever since she'd been pulled from classified work and told to disappear, to become a nobody, to let her decorated service die in a grave marked only by code name. Captain Brooke Sullivan no longer existed in any official record. Brooke Sullivan, RN, community college credential from 2011, did exist, barely, in the system at Cedar Creek Medical, Colorado Springs, on the night shift where nobody with ambitions went to work. She pushed through the double doors into the corridor, her badge reading B. Sullivan, RN in clinical sans serif font, a pale shadow of rank insignia she'd earned and could never claim. The ICU smelled like ozone and dying things. She'd learned the difference between those smells in her first month here, the acrid sharpness of a defibrillator's discharge, the deeper organic decay of organs beginning to shut down. The heart monitors created a symphony of beeping that meant nothing to most people and meant everything to her. Each tone was data. Each tone was a patient story compressed into acoustic information. She moved through the unit checking vitals, adjusting fours, noting the ones who wouldn't make it past next Tuesday. This was her world now. The quiet work. The invisible work. The work that nobody thanked you for because nobody saw you doing it. Staff Sergeant Danny Reeves occupied bed 4, and had for 31 days. The chart noted traumatic brain injury with complete vision loss from IED blast, Ramadi, 2019, and unresponsive to rehabilitation protocols, family requesting hospice consultation, prognosis poor. His mother sat in the visitor's chair, asleep, her head tilted at an angle that would give her neck pain for the next 3 days. Brooke had learned to recognize the specific exhaustion of mothers holding vigil. She'd held that same exhaustion herself, once, before she learned that some people you couldn't save. Danny's eyes moved beneath closed lids, REM sleep, probably dreaming of things he could see in his mind that he'd never see again with his eyes. The blast that had taken his vision had also taken his memory. The neurologist's report was clear on that point: extensive amygdala and hippocampal damage consistent with severe TBI, possible permanent anterograde amnesia regarding events preceding blast. He wouldn't remember her. Nobody remembered things about people they'd known before their brains got rewired by explosives. She checked his right forearm, where the 4-line ran parallel to a tattoo done in military stencil font, dark blue ink against the pale skin of a man who'd spent most of his adult life in desert sun. Sullivan. For letters. 2,316 words she could never explain. Brooke's fingers traced the outline of the letters without touching the muscle memory from a skill she shouldn't still possess. Her hands knew exactly where the radial artery ran beneath this skin. Her hands knew the weight of AM for A1 carbine that Danny had carried in his left hand while she'd covered the 6 o'clock position behind him. Her hands knew the moment his body had gone slack against her back as the blast wave hit, the sensation of his weight becoming just weight, becoming just cargo, becoming a human being she'd have to choose between saving and completing the mission. She chose both. Special forces did that. You didn't leave people behind, and you completed the objective. You did both things, or you weren't special forces anymore, you were just the person who'd failed. The Pentagon had acknowledged neither choice in its official records because the operation itself had been disavowed. Operation Phantom Sweep went sideways in ways that required erasure. The high-value target they'd extracted that night didn't exist in any database. The team member they'd lost, Sergeant Chen, had his own folder marked classified, his fingerprints removed from every database except one, the paper one locked in a safe deposit box that only Brooke knew about. The tattoo on Danny's arm was the only proof that she'd been real, that she'd existed in his life before the blast took his ability to remember. The fluorescent light above bed flickered once, twice, then stabilized. Sound traveled oddly in the ICU at this hour, the ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm, the suction pump on the wall made a thin whistling sound as it cycled, and somewhere down the corridor, a nurse was moving supplies with the kind of careless speed that came from the night shift's strange assumption of privacy. Nobody was paying attention. Nobody was watching. Brooke could stay here forever in this small moment, the one where Danny Reeves was still alive and still carried her name inked into his skin, and nobody knew what either of them had done in a place that officially didn't exist. At precisely 6:04 a.m., the tremor moved through her hands. Not visible. Not obvious. Just the faintest oscillation in her fingers as she checked his pupils, reactive, normal, the kind of response that meant he was healing in ways nobody expected. She breathed through it. 6 counts in, 7 counts out. The counted breath was a technique they'd taught her in psychological operations training, back when she'd been Captain Brooke Sullivan with a security clearance so high it had its own security clearance. The counted breath worked. Danny's mother stirred in the chair, her neck making a small sound of protest as she straightened. She was younger than Brooke by maybe 5 years, which meant she was probably older in the ways that mattered, years of worry instead of years of compartmentalized trauma. The mother's eyes opened and focused on Brooke with the particular intensity of someone who'd been taught to notice details. Military wives learned that. They learned to watch for the small signs that indicated whether their person was alive or just breathing. "How is he?" the mother asked, her voice rough from sleep and 3 weeks of being in a hospital room. "Stable," Brooke said. 10 words. Exactly 10 words. No embellishment, no false hope, no suggestion that stability meant anything other than not dying at this exact moment. She turned the 4 bag slightly to check the line for infiltration, her movements carrying the kind of efficiency that came from having done this task under fire. His heart rhythm is steady. Blood pressure is within acceptable parameters. I'll check labs when the lab tech comes through. The mother nodded, accepting this as the sum total of what she was allowed to know. She looked at her son, at his sealed eyes and the tattoo on his forearm that she'd probably asked him about 100 times and he'd probably given a non-committal answer about, the kind of answer men gave about tattoos that meant something too classified or too personal to explain. The mother looked back at Brooke, and for a fraction of a second, no more than the time it took for a heartbeat to register on a monitor, something flickered across her face. Recognition, maybe. Or just the haunted expression of someone who'd learned to accept that the world contained mysteries she would never be allowed to understand. "Thank you for taking good care of him," the mother said. "It's my job," Brooke replied, and it was true in ways that extended far beyond the hospital employment forms she'd signed under a name that was hers but wasn't entirely hers. But that wasn't the worst part of lying. The elevator dinged at 7:01 a.m., and Dr. Mercer stepped into the ICU with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. He was tall, 6'2", maybe 6'3", and carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who'd never been told no. His loafers clicked against the tile with the sound of old money. They were expensive loafers, Italian leather from a place that probably existed only at addresses in Manhattan or San Francisco, the kind of shoes that cost more than Brooke's car payment. He wore a white coat with his name embroidered in script across the left breast, MD beside it, and the coat itself looked pristine enough to suggest that no actual patient had ever bled on it. Mercer carried a tablet and a cup of coffee from someplace that definitely wasn't the hospital cafeteria, something with a logo that Brooke recognized from commercials but had never been able to afford. He moved through the ICU like he owned it, like the monitors and ventilators and carefully dying people were props in a stage production where he was the starring role. He didn't acknowledge Brooke. That was the first thing she noticed. Not a glance, not a nod, not the kind of basic eye contact that human beings typically exchanged with other human beings sharing the same physical space. He looked through her the way you look through air, like she was a transparent thing that occupied space but didn't matter. He stopped at the nurse's station and set his coffee down on the desk with the sound of a period at the end of a sentence. Final. Authoritative. The kind of gesture that suggested the coffee cup had been placed on that particular spot by fate itself, and everyone else in the unit was responsible for ensuring it remained undisturbed. "Who's the charge nurse this morning?" he asked, and his voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage, powerful, contained, waiting. Sarah Chen, no relation to Sergeant Chen, though Brooke had wondered about that once and decided coincidence was a thing humans invented to maintain their sanity, looked up from her charts. "That's me." "Dr. Mercer?" "Yes," he said, and it wasn't a confirmation so much as an announcement. "I've been assigned to the ICU effective immediately. I'll be taking primary responsibility for all cases. I assume you have a handoff prepared." Sarah's face did that thing faces did when their owners had just been informed of information that would make their day significantly more complicated. "Of course." "We can?" "Not now," Mercer interrupted. "I'll need coffee first." "Fresh coffee, not this swill." He gestured at his own coffee with disdain, as if it had personally offended him by existing. "And I'll need a full review of all current patients, but particularly bed 4. The blind veteran. What's his prognosis?" Brooke was still checking vitals on bed 3. Her hands remained steady. Her face remained neutral. She was a thing that occupied space but didn't matter, and that was exactly how she preferred the world to think of her. "Poor," Sarah said. "Family is discussing hospice. He's been mostly unresponsive to rehabilitation. TBI prognosis is generally." "I didn't ask for a medical school recitation," Mercer said. "I asked for the prognosis. Yes or no? Can we save him?" "It's complicated," Sarah began. "Everything is complicated," Mercer replied. "I'm asking if he's salvageable." One-word answer. Brooke turned her head slightly, letting her eyes move from the blood pressure cuff on bed 3 to the doctor's face. There was something in the set of his jaw, something in the way he'd positioned himself between Sarah and the rest of the unit, that suggested he'd come to Cedar Creek Medical with the specific intention of establishing dominance quickly. People like Mercer didn't enter situations assuming they were equal to the people already there. People like Mercer entered situations assuming they were above everyone, and were waiting to see if anyone would bother to argue about it. "Probably not," Sarah said quietly. "Then we're probably wasting resources on him," Mercer said. He picked up his coffee cup despite having just insulted it, and took a sip. He didn't wince at the taste, which suggested he'd lied about it being swill and was simply establishing the precedent that his opinions were correct regardless of the facts. Let's hope his mother understands that sometimes the kindest thing we can do is let go. I'll make that conversation easier for her. He walked away from the nurse's station, his footsteps clicking across the tile like a metronome set to the tempo of someone who'd never had to listen to anyone else's rhythm. Brooke returned her attention to the blood pressure cuff, completed the reading, and made the note in the chart. 118/76. Perfectly normal. Perfectly average. Perfectly invisible. Morning rounds at Cedar Creek Medical moved like clockwork. Dr. Mercer stood at the foot of Danny Reeves's bed, 3 medical students flanking him like apprentices at an altar, their tablets glowing in the harsh fluorescent wash. Brooke stood at the 4 pump, checking the bag of normal saline dripping into Danny's left arm, her movements precise and practiced. She didn't look up when Mercer began to speak. "Let's discuss appropriate scope of practice," he said, his voice pitched for the students, not for Danny or his mother sitting in the chair beside the bed. Community college nurses, he paused, making sure Brooke heard the emphasis, often lack the theoretical foundation for complex blast-induced traumatic brain injury protocols. The cognitive load is simply beyond their training. Mrs. Reeves shifted uncomfortably. Her hands twisted in her lap. Danny's head remained still on the pillow, his bandaged eyes catching no light. Mercer turned to Brooke with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Sullivan, where did you study again?" She took one measured breath. "Pikes Peak Community College, sir." "Exactly." He gestured at the monitors tracking Danny's vitals, at the flow sheets clipped to the wall. "Mrs. Reeves, rest assured that we have board-certified physicians managing your son's care. Not just," he paused again, letting the silence stretch thin, enthusiastic hands. One of the medical students looked at his shoes. Another found sudden interest in the cardiac monitor. The third stared at Brooke as if she'd just materialized from a mistake. Danny's mother's jaw tightened. Brooke's hand remained steady on the 4-line. She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She simply adjusted the drip rate by 0.3 milliliters per hour and moved to the next monitor without acknowledgement. But that wasn't the worst part. At lunch, she sat alone in the break room with her container of rice and grilled chicken, the afternoon sun slanting through the windows in bands of honey-colored light. Jennifer arrived first, grabbed her salad from the refrigerator, glanced at the table where Brooke sat, and walked back out without a word. The door swung shut. Then Marcus pushed in, saw her, executed a sharp about-face, and took his sandwich somewhere else. The third time, Kate actually slowed for a moment, a flicker of hesitation, a human instinct toward kindness fighting something stronger, before she picked up her coffee and left, her footsteps quick on the linoleum tile. From the hallway outside, Mercer's voice drifted through the open door like a fog that wouldn't lift. He was speaking to one of the interns, his tone conversational, almost avuncular. "Sullivan has boundary issues," he was saying. "Gets emotionally attached to patients in inappropriate ways. You'll see it, she lingers at the bedside, holds their hands longer than protocol allows. That kind of enmeshment compromises clinical judgment. Watch for that." Brooke didn't move. She didn't set down her fork with a clatter or press her palms against her eyes in the darkness of a supply closet. She simply finished her rice, chewed each bite slowly, and returned the container to her locker with the same precision she'd once used to fold a dress uniform that no longer existed. The trembling that had visited her at 0600 was gone now, replaced by something deeper and colder, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. That afternoon, she passed the unit assignment board on her way to the medication room. Her name was there, right below the daily roster, under a bold red header, corrective action pending, unauthorized deviation from care plan protocol. Displayed for every visitor, every physician, every volunteer who walked through the ICU doors. The words didn't tremble. The letters didn't swim. She read them once, absorbed the specificity of the accusation, unauthorized deviation, not just a note or a concern but a formal charge, and continued walking toward the med room as if the board had been discussing someone else entirely. But her phone was already vibrating against her hip. Danny's mother was waiting outside his room that afternoon, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes red-rimmed. "Nurse Sullivan," she said, and the formality of the address made Brooke's shoulders tense by an almost imperceptible fraction. "Dr. Mercer mentioned that you might not be qualified enough for my son's complex case. He suggested we might request someone with more credentials." The words were Mercer's. Brooke could hear them in the phrasing, the hesitation before qualified enough, the borrowed concern masquerading as maternal care. Brooke looked at Mrs. Reeves directly. Their eyes met. Mrs. Reeves was a woman whose son had come home broken in ways that no prosthetics or surgeries could repair, a woman whose hope was eroding one day at a time, a woman who had been convinced that the young nurse in front of her wasn't good enough to save what remained. A single tear traced down Brooke's cheek, not from fear, not from hurt, but from the weight of restraint, the terrible force of keeping everything contained when everything inside her was screaming to explain, to defend, to tell this woman what her son's name was doing in permanent ink on a dead man's arm in Ramadi 6 years ago. She wiped the tear with her thumb, took a measured breath, and spoke with the kind of calm that carried the weight of 1,000 hours of survival. I've kept your son alive before. I can do it again. Mrs. Reeves stared at her. Something flickered across her face, a question, a fragment of doubt about the certainty Mercer had planted in her mind. But she said nothing. She simply turned and walked back into Danny's room, her uncertainty hanging in the hallway like humidity. At 0300, the monitor screamed. Brooke was 2 floors down, finishing a documentation note at a desk that still smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee, when the code alarm bleated through the hospital's overhead system. Code blue, ICU Bay 4. Danny's room. She was already moving before the announcement finished, muscle memory taking over, feet hitting the tile in a rhythm that had learned itself in a field hospital in Ramadi where morphine ran out and improvisation was the only currency that mattered. His chest monitor was flatline screaming when she burst into the room. Danny's body was rigid, his back arched, his breathing labored and wrong. His oxygen saturation was dropping like a stone, 88, 81, 76, the numbers falling in real time. Tension pneumothorax. She could see it in the asymmetry of his chest, see it in the way his trachea was deviating left, see it in the panic rising in his body even through his sedation. She hit the code button. Her hand was steady. Mercer arrived 4 minutes later, which was too long when someone's heart was in arrest and their lung had collapsed inward like a fist. He was carrying the thoracotomy tray with the care of a man who had never actually used one, his hands already shaking as he tried to locate the intercostal space between Danny's 4th and 5th ribs. The scalpel trembled in his grip. Danny's monitor flickered once and then flatlined into the long, terrible silence of ventricular fibrillation. Mercer stared at the monitor. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Brooke's hands had stopped trembling. She'd traded that particular weakness for something else 6 years ago, traded it on a night when she'd carried a dying man through mortar fire to an extraction point, traded it for the muscle memory that lived in her palms and fingers like a second heartbeat. She could see the field hospital now, the canvas tent, the morphine running out, Danny bleeding on a stretcher made from a door, his right arm already tattooed with a name he wouldn't remember. She grabbed the scalpel from Mercer's shaking hand. The incision came in one fluid motion, through skin, through muscle, spreading the tissue with her fingers until the chest cavity opened before her like a door. She inserted her gloved hand between his ribs, felt the space where his lung should have been inflating, and found it collapsed and useless. Her fingers located his heart. The muscle was still, silent, asking nothing of her anymore. She didn't hesitate. 1 compression. 2. 3. 4. The heart kicked. Felt it contract under her palm with the fury of something refusing to die. The monitor beeped. Once. Twice. The rhythm climbing back toward something resembling life. Danny gasped. His body shuddered. Oxygen saturation began to climb, 72, 78, 84, numbers crawling upward 1 decimal point at a time. Mercer stared at her, and in his eye something shifted. The contempt was still there, but it had cracked. What showed through was something close to fear, the kind of fear you feel when the thing you dismissed as ordinary suddenly reveals that it can do things you didn't know were possible, things that require a kind of knowledge that doesn't come from textbooks or medical school or the privilege of being born into a surname that opened every door. "Get me a size 32 French chest tube," Brooke said to the resident standing frozen by the wall. Her voice was no longer deferential. It was no longer soft. 20 milligrams of midazolam for sedation. And someone needs to get his portable chest X-ray down here now. The resident moved. Everyone moved. Danny's heart kept beating under the fluorescent lights, kept fighting its way back toward rhythm, kept refusing the easiest answer, which was to stop. The flatline screamed through the ICU like a siren nobody wanted to hear. 3:03 in the morning. Oxygen saturation at 61 and dropping. Danny Reeves's chest rose on one side only, the right lung collapsed under pressure, air trapped between his ribs and the chest wall, pressure mounting with every breath that couldn't escape. Trachea deviated left. His asymmetrical chest told the story in a language Brooke had learned in Ramadi, learned in dust and blood and the kind of darkness that never quite leaves your hands. Tension pneumothorax. Not a gradual emergency. A ticking clock wearing a human face. She was there in 2 seconds. Not running, moving with the kind of economical precision that soldiers develop, the kind that civilians mistake for calmness. Her eyes tracked the monitor, sat dropping, 60, 58, 54. The kind of numbers where the brain starts dying. The kind of numbers where you don't have time to think. You have time to act. Call respiratory. Get me a chest tray. Her voice wasn't loud. It cut through the monitor, screaming like a blade through water. Mercer was in the room for seconds behind her, still buttoning his white coat, his eyes still soft with sleep. He saw the numbers on the screen and the color drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug. His hands shook as he reached for the thoracotomy equipment, fingers fumbling with the sealed package, the plastic refusing to tear clean. Once. Twice. His breathing had already shifted into panic mode, shallow and rapid. The kind of breathing that spreads to everyone else in the room if you let it. Brooke didn't let it. She moved to the bedside with her hands already steady, already reading the anatomy like a map she'd memorized under fire. The space between ribs 4 and 5. The intercostal artery running along the inferior margin of the rib. The pleural space waiting behind layers of muscle and fascia and skin that had grown thin and fragile in the weeks of Danny's hospital stay. One incision, one precise movement, and the air would escape. The lung would re-expand. The pressure would bleed away. The kid would live. Mercer's hands shook harder. The scalpel fell. It clattered against the metal tray like a coin dropped on tile, and in that sound was everything that separated them. Fear. Hesitation. The kind of paralysis that came from a mind moving slower than the body's need to survive. Brooke reached down and picked it up without breaking stride. The blade was cold in her hand, familiar in a way that made something ancient and certain wake up inside her chest. Not anger. Not even urgency. Just clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you've already done this before, already held this knife in this exact way, already made this exact cut while mortars screamed and dust hung thick enough to choke on. You need to step back, doctor. Her voice had changed. The deferential nurse was gone. What remained was something else, something that filled the room the way pressure fills a collapsed lung, inevitable and total. Mercer started to move toward her, started to object, but the way she held the blade stopped him. Not threatening. Just certain. The way someone holds a tool when they're about to use it perfectly. He stepped back. His jaw worked silently, words forming and dying unspoken. Brooke's hands moved on their own. The scalpel went in at the 4th intercostal space, the incision clean and deliberate, for centimeters and done. No hesitation. No second thoughts. The muscle parted like water. The pleural membrane peeled back. And then the sound, the hiss of air escaping, the pneumothorax releasing like a held breath finally let go. That sound meant everything. That sound meant he lived. His oxygen saturation didn't climb immediately. It didn't work that way in the real world, despite what television promised. Sat 52. 50. Then 48, and Brooke's left hand was already moving, already positioning, already finding the rhythm. Her right hand pressed, finding the left ventricular wall through the incision, feeling for the beat beneath her palm. Nothing. The heart silent under her fingers like a room with all the air sucked out. She compressed. Once. Twice. Pushing blood through chambers that had forgotten how to work. Her hands moved with the steady rhythm of someone who'd held lives together in conditions that would have broken someone rational. 5 compressions. 10. 15. The fluorescent light above Danny's bed hummed and buzzed with the white noise of expensive equipment and expensive failure, and underneath it, the sound of her own breathing, controlled, measured, the kind of breathing that came from a tactical breathing pattern drilled into muscle memory. Then it came back. The blip. The sinus rhythm finding its way back onto the monitor like a traveler returning home. 68 beats per minute. 70. 72. The heart remembering what it was supposed to do. The room exhaled. Everyone had been holding their breath without knowing it. Brooks' hand stayed on his chest for 3 more seconds, 5 cardiac cycles, feeling for the certainty, feeling for the commitment in that beat. Only when the rhythm stabilized to 84 did she step back. She was breathing normally. Her hands were steady. Her eyes met Mercer's for exactly 1 second, and in that second, he understood something fundamental about the nurse he'd been humiliating for the last 36 hours. He understood and didn't know what he'd understood, which was worse. Get me a chest tube. 14 French. And push 1 of epi, just to make sure he stays with us. Her voice sounded different now. Not soft. Not deferential. Commands, not requests. Muscle memory translated into words. The way a captain gives orders when lives hang in the balance. The nurse, Martinez, newer to the unit, moved immediately, no hesitation, no need for Mercer to repeat the order. That was the difference between a voice that asked permission and a voice that knew it wouldn't be denied. Martinez was already drawing medication from the crash cart, already preparing the chest tube kit. The room shifted around Brooks' competence like water flowing around a stone. Mercer stood 3 feet away from the bed, his hands still trembling. His white coat suddenly looked like a costume. His credentials suddenly seemed written in a language he'd never actually learned to read. He opened his mouth. Closed it. The words he wanted to say, the objections, the assertions of hierarchy, the reminders of who was supposed to be in charge, all of them felt small and stupid in the presence of what had just happened. A patient should be dead. A nurse had refused to let him. Brooke worked the chest tube in with the kind of precision that took decades to build, that couldn't be faked or learned in a lecture hall. The drainage bag darkened with blood and air, confirmation of everything the clinical picture had already screamed. She was securing the tube, taping it down, checking the water seal for the telltale bubbling that meant the pneumothorax was truly releasing, when Mercer's phone buzzed. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that by 6 in the morning, Mercer had already filed the formal complaints with the hospital board. Copies printed on his personal letterhead, timestamp showing 5:16 a.m. He'd cited Colorado Medical Practice Act Section 12-38-132 exactly 17 times. Performing procedures outside scope of practice. That phrase appeared highlighted in electric yellow, appearing in the margins like an accusation someone had decided to emphasize again and again. He'd added a new note at the bottom: Nurse Sullivan exhibits signs of stolen valor and pathological attachment to military patients, suggesting psychological instability that may indicate a danger to vulnerable populations. The words were technically true. She had stolen valor in a sense. Her valor was stolen because it had been legally erased. And her attachment to military patients wasn't pathological, it was operational. It was the same reason a captain in the field didn't walk away from her soldiers. You kept them alive. That was the mission. That was the only mission that mattered. Brooke read the report in the break room at 7, when Mercer had made sure everyone on the unit would see it. The document sat in her inbox like a knife left on a table. Professional. Damaging. Written in the language of institutional power, the kind of language that could end careers without ever raising a voice. She poured coffee into a styrofoam cup and sat in the corner where nobody ever sat today. The coffee was 12 hours old, bitter enough to strip enamel, and she drank it without tasting it. Her hands were completely still. Not trembling. Not shaking. Completely, perfectly still. The kind of still that came from someone who'd learned that emotion was a luxury with a price tag attached. Danny would live. That was the mathematics of it. 1 patient saved. 1 career about to be destroyed. The balance sheet of emergency medicine, where you gave everything in a moment of crisis and then paid for it for the rest of your life. Her phone sat on the break room table. The phone that nobody was supposed to call. the number that had been disconnected when Operation Phantom Sweep ended, and Captain Brooke Sullivan died on paper in a classified file in the Pentagon basement. She looked at it and didn't pick it up. Not yet. Not until the moment when picking it up became necessary. By 9 in the morning, the documentation was flawless. Dr. Mercer had filed a 20-page incident report with the Colorado State Board of Nursing, each page stamped with institutional authority and his signature in expensive fountain pen. The cover letter invoked Colorado Medical Practice Act Section 12-38-132 on an authorized surgical intervention, demanding immediate termination of Brooke Sullivan for performing procedures outside her scope of practice. He'd attached emails he'd sent to 3 nursing supervisors at competing hospitals, colleagues who owed him favors, and included witness statements from nurses he'd coached through break-room conversations about her boundary issues and pathological attachment to military patients. The file folder was an inch thick. Professional. Devastating. By 10 o'clock, the hospital board had received copies. By noon, the decision was made. HR Director Patricia Walsh sat behind a desk that smelled of burnt coffee and institutional fear. Mercer stood beside her with arms crossed, his white coat pristine, watching as though he owned the moment. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in a sickly yellow haze. Brooke stood in front of the desk, back straight, jaw set with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. She'd learned long ago that trembling was a luxury. That breaking in front of your enemy was surrender. So she didn't break. Suspended pending investigation, Walsh said, sliding a folder across the desk that trembled slightly from her own discomfort. Effective immediately. Your badge and access cards need to be surrendered now. Brooke reached into her scrub pocket and placed her badge on the desk, the laminated photo from 6 months ago, before everything changed, her name printed in small letters, B. Sullivan, RN. The plastic was worn smooth from her thumb. There's a 20-page incident report, Walsh continued, not meeting her eyes. Dr. Mercer has documented serious concerns about your clinical judgment. The board will need to investigate before we can make any permanent. She won't be cleared, Mercer said quietly. His voice carried the weight of surgical precision. The evidence is substantial. I'm recommending termination with prejudice. Brooke watched his face. Watched the satisfaction settle into the corners of his mouth like a predator that had just secured its kill. He'd built this trap carefully, each complaint layered on top of the last, each nurse's statement corroborating the narrative he'd planted. She couldn't defend herself with the truth. She couldn't tell them that the thoracotomy saved Danny Reeves's life, that she'd done field surgery in Ramadi with worse equipment and worse conditions and better results. She couldn't tell them about Operation Phantom Sweep, about the classified orders that had erased her from military records, about the Pentagon decision that required her to disappear completely and never surface. That truth lived in a sealed envelope in a Pentagon filing cabinet. The world was allowed to forget she had ever existed as anything but a nurse. The investigation process typically takes 4 to 6 weeks, Walsh said, her voice carrying the hollow comfort of protocol. You'll be notified if there are any developments. There won't be, Mercer said. Brooke stood. She didn't argue. She didn't defend. She simply turned and walked toward the door, and Mercer stepped aside as though she were already a ghost. Behind her, she heard Walsh say something about severance details, about paperwork, about HR procedures designed to soften the blow of institutional destruction. The words fell like rain on concrete, useful only for the sound they made. That evening, the hospital laundry was empty except for the rhythmic thud of industrial washers and the chemical smell of bleach mixing with something else, something like surrender. Brooke held her scrubs in one hand, the blue fabric still warm from the hospital dryer. 5 years of shifts compressed into cotton and polyester. She began folding with the precision she'd once applied to her dress uniform, each corner aligned perfectly, each crease sharp enough to cut. Her name tag was stitched across the left chest, B. Sullivan, RN. Just a name. Not a rank. Not a call sign. Not Valkyrie 6 or Captain or anything that acknowledged the weight of what she'd carried and refused to put down. The fold took exactly 30 seconds. Hospital corners first, then the sleeves, then the final rectangle, uniform enough to display in a window. The precision was muscle memory. 23 years of it. "You got the fold right," a voice said. Brooke looked up. Martinez, the laundry supervisor, stood in the doorway. He was maybe 60, with the posture of someone who'd learned to carry weight. His name tag read V. Martinez, veteran. She'd seen him before, had assumed he was just part of the hospital machinery. Now she wondered what wars he'd survived. "Most people can't do it that tight," he continued. "Civilians fold. You fold military. There's a difference." She nodded once and placed the scrubs in the donation bin, on top of dozens of other pairs, each one just a nurse now. Just fabric. Just history erased. The tattoo on Danny Reeves's right forearm remained covered by hospital blankets while his chest drained fluid in steady drips and his oxygen saturation climbed from 68 to 92%. The thoracotomy had saved his life. The emergency decompression, the manual cardiac massage, the precise incision between the ribs with a scalpel grabbed from a surgeon's trembling hands, all of it had worked. He was stable now. Conscious. Asking for the nurse who'd saved him. But the chart notes read differently. Mercer's handwriting was clinical and controlled, patient survival despite an authorized nursing intervention. Recommend disciplinary action to prevent future liability and institutional exposure. Recommend mandatory physician oversight of all future nursing decisions. Mrs. Reeves called at 3 in the afternoon asking why Nurse Sullivan wasn't on shift. "Personnel matter," the nurse who answered said, her voice tight. "I can't discuss that. Would you like to speak with our patient advocate?" She hung up without answering. The waiting room television played daytime talk shows at low volume. Nobody watched. Two families sat in separate corners pretending the other didn't exist. A man in a wheelchair stared at nothing. The world moved on without Brooke Sullivan. The hospital moved on without her. The night shift would come and go with someone else managing the ICU, someone less dangerous, someone less likely to save lives in ways that threatened institutional hierarchy. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Mercer had won. Not just against her, but against everything she'd tried to protect. Danny Reeves was alive, but his mother would never know the real cost of that survival. The tattoo on his arm would remain a mystery. The scar tissue in his lungs would never connect to the woman who'd etched her name into his nervous system during a mortar attack in Ramadi. The classified records would stay sealed. The Pentagon would keep her service secret. She would remain erased. And Dr. Mercer would continue his rounds in his $1,000 shoes, confident in his victory, unaware that the elevator doors were about to open on something he couldn't possibly understand. The call came at 6 the next morning. Before Brooke had finished her coffee. Before she'd started the application process at 3 other hospitals that probably wouldn't hire her anyway, too much institutional baggage, too many questions, too much of a liability. The phone rang with a number blocked from caller ID. "Is this Brooke Sullivan?" A woman's voice. Military precision. No question mark at the end, which meant she already knew the answer. "Yes," Brooke said. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Hendricks, United States Marine Corps. I'm calling from Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. We need to speak with you about your classified service record." Brooke's hand tightened on the coffee cup. The ceramic was still warm. The world didn't change. But something shifted. Somewhere in the machinery of government, something had moved. "What about my service record?" she asked carefully. "It's been unsealed," Hendricks said. "And that's going to change everything." The ICU doors slid open at 1,447 hours, and the stretcher that rolled through carried a man whose face drained of all color the moment his eyes found hers in the hallway. Rashid Al-Mansour, former Iraqi insurgent turned U.S. protected intelligence asset, went rigid against the monitor leads like he'd seen a ghost, or worse, like he'd seen the exact ghost he'd spent 23 years running from. His lips moved once, twice, then the word spilled out in a whisper that echoed across the trauma bay, Valkyrie. Valkyrie 6. The attending physician's head snapped toward the monitors, then toward the halted stretcher, confusion spreading across his face like he'd just heard someone speak in tongues. Nobody whispered code names in Cedar Creek Medical. Not here. Not now. But Brooke stood perfectly still near the medication station, her spine aligned with the fluorescent lights overhead, one hand resting on a bag of saline as if it were the most natural thing in the world to have your buried identity called out loud by a man on a stretcher. The room's air pressure changed. Everyone felt it, but nobody could name it. The attending physician was reaching for his radio when the conference room doors at the end of the hallway opened with the kind of authority that made nurses instinctively straighten their posture. A Marine colonel in dress blues, his ribbons displaying a geometry of service, bronze star visible even from 30 feet away, walked with a kind of precision that suggested his boots had touched every hard surface in 4 continents. He carried a manila folder thick enough to hold state secrets, because that's exactly what it held. Behind him came 2 officers Brooke didn't recognize but whose bearing suggested they made decisions that changed wars. The colonel's eyes locked on hers across the ICU, a flicker of recognition that lasted exactly 1 second, then he turned toward the conference room and jerked his head, one motion, a command disguised as an invitation. Brooke set down the saline bag. Her movements were unhurried, economical, the way someone moves when they know exactly where they're going and why. The other nurses watched her walk past them, not understanding, not yet, toward the conference room where a 2-star general was already removing his cover. The colonel spread Danny's medical transport records across the polished table, the kind of documents that normally stayed in Pentagon safes, classified higher than most senators' clearance levels. His voice carried the weight of testimony, patient evacuated under fire by Captain Brooke Sullivan, who sustained shrapnel wounds while providing covering fire on a secondary extraction corridor during Operation Phantom Sweep, Ramadi, March 2009. He paused, and in that pause lived everything the hospital had tried to erase. Sullivan's medical intervention in the field exceeded standard protocol. Without her actions, the patient would not have survived transport. Recommendation, medal availor consideration, immediately upon service record unsealing. The general's eyes moved to the folded flag resting in Brooke's hands, the flag from Sergeant Chen's casket, the one she'd carried in her locker for 15 years, wrapped in plastic, never displayed, never forgotten. He stood up slowly, the kind of deliberate motion that required stillness in everyone around him, and saluted that flag with his right hand drawn to his temple as if it were the only thing that mattered. Nobody in that room had ever seen a 2-star general salute a folded piece of fabric held by a contract nurse in hospital scrubs, but the moment felt like scripture. The Pentagon liaison, a woman with the bearing of someone who'd briefed presidents, opened a leather portfolio and read with the precision of someone reading legal declarations, Captain Sullivan's classified service record has been unsealed as of 0800 this morning. Code name Valkyrie 6 is hereby released from operational blackout effective immediately. All prior communications restrictions are null. The following medals are now authorized for public recognition: Bronze Star, Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and the Navy Cross, awarded in absentia in 2010, officially presented this date. The words hung in the air like fog settling on water. Brooke's jaw moved once, not a clench, just a single motion that suggested something deep inside had shifted. The general extended a blue case the size of a greeting card, small enough to hold in a single palm, heavy enough to hold a life sentence and absolution simultaneously. Inside, the Navy Cross medal on its ribbon, the Navy Cross that presidents gave to people who did impossible things when nobody was watching, the medal that said Brooke Sullivan hadn't just survived the Pentagon's war, she'd changed it, altered its trajectory, prevented casualties that would have rippled forward into coffins and empty chairs at dinner tables. What happened next didn't unfold gradually. It exploded. Someone in Cedar Creek Medical had filmed Dr. Mercer's humiliation of Brooke 3 days earlier, his voice on video, loud enough to carry through open doors, asking if a community college nurse understood blast-induced traumatic brain injury, asking if she was developmentally equipped for critical care, his face arranged in the kind of contempt that photographs. That footage uploaded to TikTok at 18:09 hours by an ICU tech who'd finally had enough. By 18:47 hours it had been reposted to military advocacy groups, the 320,000-member Nursing Excellence Alliance, 17 veteran support networks, and the official social media accounts of 3 U.S. congressmen. By 21:40 hours it had 4.2 million views. Comments poured in like artillery fire, nurses sharing their own Mercers, veterans explaining what Captain Sullivan had done in Ramadi, fellow Special Forces operators verifying the tattoo on Danny Reeves's arm, each comment a brick in the wall that was burying Dr. Mercer alive under his own documented cruelty. Dr. Raymond Webber, Mercer's medical school mentor, 73-year-old cardiothoracic surgeon with awards enough to fill 3 offices, released a public statement at 06:03 the next morning. His voice on the recorded video, calm, disappointed, lethal, addressed the camera in his study at Johns Hopkins like he was delivering a patient's final diagnosis. I trained Dr. Mercer. I invested in him. I believed in him. I am horrified to witness him weaponize his authority against those who sacrifice for this nation. I formally disavow my former student and recommend immediate suspension of his Colorado medical license pending investigation. A doctor who targets vulnerable patients deserves neither his white coat nor his stethoscope. The statement had been shared 847,000 times within 6 hours. Hospital boards don't move fast. Cedar Creek Medical moved at light speed. An emergency meeting convened at 0900. Mercer's documentation trail, the emails, the policy citations, the meticulously crafted complaints, became evidence against him when examined by lawyers who understood that life-saving emergency intervention supersedes every protocol ever written. The Colorado Medical Practice Act Section 12-38-132 that Mercer had cited so carefully didn't apply to cardiac arrest in the ICU. It never had. His lawyers knew it. The board knew it. He knew it, which made every complaint he'd filed look like calculated vendetta rather than professional concern. By noon, Mercer's privileges were suspended pending investigation. By afternoon, he'd resigned rather than face termination. The chief of staff personally appeared in the ICU to find Brooke, offering reinstatement with full back pay, apologies that weren't actually apologies because nothing fixes what had been broken. Brooke accepted the reinstatement, technically. But her phone had already buzzed with a message from Walter Reed Medical Center, from a colonel who'd been waiting for her classified record to be unsealed, inviting her to come home to active duty, to command a trauma unit that had been operating short-staffed for 3 years waiting for someone who'd actually seen combat medicine. She was going to say yes. The only thing left was Danny. Danny Reeves regained consciousness at 03:07 and his first question, asked in a voice still drugged with sedation, was, "Why does everyone keep talking about someone named Sullivan?" His mother sat up from the chair where she'd been sleeping in her clothes for 18 hours, her eyes red-rimmed and desperate, and she showed him the tattoo on his right forearm, her voice shaking, "Because she saved you. In Ramadi, she carried you when nobody else could. And 3 days ago, when you stopped breathing, she saved you again." Danny's hand moved to his arm, fingers tracing letters he couldn't see but could somehow feel, the grooves where ink had been driven into flesh 8,000 miles and 19 years ago by a woman whose face he would never remember because the blast had stolen it from him. He cried. Not from pain, the morphine handled that, but from the maddening frustration of knowing his own life was written on his own skin in someone else's name, and not being able to see her face to say thank you. Mercer cleared out his office that evening, alone, at 20:43 hours when most of the hospital had gone home. His hands, which had held surgical instruments with the confidence of men who've never doubted themselves, trembled as he packed his diplomas into a cardboard box labeled fragile in black marker. The framed photographs came down from the walls, Mercer at conferences, Mercer receiving awards, Mercer smiling in the center of groups of people who would no longer return his calls. He didn't take the photo of himself with Dr. Webber. He left that on the wall, backward, facing the white paint. His exit badge still worked, nobody had revoked it yet, and he carried the cardboard box through the staff entrance, past a bulletin board where someone had already posted a printed photograph of Captain Brooke Sullivan in dress uniform, her Navy Cross visible, the caption reading, "True Heroism." The parking lot was empty. The Colorado Springs night was clear enough to see stars, and Mercer sat in his car for 23 minutes before turning the key, staring at nothing in particular, understanding with a kind of clarity that only comes to people who've already lost everything that he'd picked a fight with someone who'd survived worse than professional destruction. He'd picked a fight with someone built to endure. The phone footage continued spreading. Military advocacy networks shared it with commentary. Nursing organizations used it in ethics training. By the time the hospital board formally revoked Mercer's privileges, making the suspension permanent, making the investigation academic, nobody was paying attention to the board's statement anymore. They were already focused on what came next. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your history, if you've ever had to stay silent while someone smaller tried to destroy you, if you've ever wondered whether the world would ever know what you actually were, tell me in the comments. And if you ever needed proof that the quietest people in the room might be holding it all together, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because next segment, Brooke's going home. And Danny's finally going to understand why his own arm was screaming her name.